I'm not sure if it's appropriate to extend a welcome on Tisha B'Av, but if it is appropriate to do so, then I'm pleased to have the opportunity to share with everyone today some thoughts on remembering the Hevron Massacre from August 1929. Just to say, after the talk on Hevron, we'll have the Chavetz Chaim Heritage Foundation video presentation, which is always of an excellent standard, and then we'll finish in time to daven Ma'ariv and to break the fast. There are blood-curdling accounts of the Hevron Massacre that are available online and in print, and today I would like to look at those terrible events in the wider context as well. And I want to say at the outset that I am grateful for some further documents provided by our good friend Ari Kisselstein. When he saw that I'm speaking on this subject, he got in touch right away, and he said that his father was among those who survived the massacre. He looks young and dashing, but his father was a young student in the Hevron yeshiva, and he provided me with some fascinating documents. To be honest, some of the information there is so harrowing, I can't bring myself to present it in detail. But we will talk about the massacre itself, of course, but I would like to place it in a wider context also. Hevron is one of the four holy cities. For hundreds of years, as the Jewish world began to, or even before they began to appreciate or aspire to moving to the land of Israel, it was already the fact, so to speak, on the ground that the Jewish presence in the land of Israel was pretty much limited to the four holy cities. Those are Jerusalem and Hevron, also in the north, Tveria and Tzfat. Of those, Jerusalem and Hevron, of course, are biblical cities, holy cities. Tveria really is a Roman city, but it was one of the cities where Jews lived for many hundreds of years. And then Tzfat, especially around the late 15th century, because of its proximity to Meron. So some of the exiles, some of the Spanish exiles, especially some very devout and holy, gifted sages, made their way to Tzfat, and that's of course where the Kabbalistic teachings and studies and the circle of the Ari and Rav Moshe Cordovaro developed. So those were the four holy cities, and really from around probably the 15th century until the 19th century, Jews were to be found in the land of Israel pretty much only in those four holy cities, of which Hevron is one. Of course, it's the Ir HaAvos, the city of the patriarchs. It's where the Maras HaMachpelah is positioned. And Rabbeinu Bechaya, who I call him my friend Rabbeinu Bechaya because I've greatly enjoyed studying his commentary over many years. So he writes a very beautiful passage in the beginning of Parshas Chaye Sarah, where the death of Sarah is described and her burial in the cave of Machpelah in Hevron, Kiryas Arba hi Hevron. So Rabbeinu Bechai says the word Hevron is related to the word Chibur. Chibur means attachment. That is the place where heaven and earth are linked, and that is the place where the souls of great people who are interred in Hevron, so to speak, ascend. It's like the passageway to heaven. It's the Chibur, the connection. Hevron Lashon Chibur. That's Rabbeinu Bechai. You have it in your outline there as well. Of course, Maras HaMachpelah, for good or for better, is holy to our cousins, the Yishmaelim, as well. The Arabs, the Muslims, I should say more correctly, the Muslims venerate the memory of the patriarchs, and they regard that location as a holy spot. In fact, Hevron is one of the four holy cities of Islam. In our thought, perhaps it would be second only to Yerushalayim. In their thought as well, it's probably fourth after Jerusalem and after Mecca and Medina. This has a contemporary echo in the sense that the UNESCO scandal tainted a few years ago proclaimed Hevron as a Palestinian World Heritage Site without any reference to its Jewish roots. And this was especially galling, I would say, to every every believing Jew and anyone who regards the land of Israel as holy to the Jewish people. But that is the reality, and as we shall see, there are bitter fruits of that circumstance that we will soon discuss. Also, I saw, and I can't remember where, may have been in my friend for this year, Chida. I should have written down where I saw it. It's too clever for me to have thought of on my own. But Hevron and Churban have the same letters. And again, to me, this is a bitter irony which found its toxic, tragic expression in the events of 90 years ago in 1929. I want to talk about the history of Hevron a little bit. Let's say in modern times. In 1659, Abraham Pereira, I don't know if Denise is here. Is that here, Denise? No. Okay. Denise Levinson is Pereira. So this may have been one of her ancestors because her family does come from Amsterdam. They live in Amsterdam for many generations. I don't think Anthony's here either. We can tell her about it. So 1659, Abraham Pereira was a very wealthy Dutch Jew of Spanish origins, and he was a philanthropist, and he created a yeshiva in Hevron called Chesed LaAvraham, and it was a decisive factor in the spiritual growth of the community. And from that time, although it had ups and downs, we'll soon see, but it became established as a place of Torah study as well. It became like provided the physical basis for the study of Torah, and Torah students who were able to do so made their way to Hevron. Although, actually, Rav Avraham Azulai, who was a great-grandfather of Chida, one of the great Kabbalists within the Azulai family, so he already moved to Hevron from Fez in 1599. When we were in Morocco, we saw some of the graves of members of the Azulai family. But he was one of the great personalities of this famous Azulai family, and he made his way already in 1599, very early. So Chida, as we'll mention him shortly, was associated with Hevron. The family lived there for centuries. There was a setback in 1663 when Shabtai Tzvi, the notorious false messiah, came to visit Hevron on his way to Egypt. And his visit created a great furor, a great excitement, and there were many people who bought into his claim of being the Messiah. Of course, many people did not agree, and actually the turmoil was a setback for Hevron, as it was for the rest of the Jewish world as well, when Shabtai Tzvi turned out to be a bust. There was always grinding poverty. If you look in your outline in number 2, letter C, it says 3/24 from Yachatz. Yachatz is an acronym: Yerushalayim, Hevron, Tzfat. Those 3 cities, they got together to have a fundraising campaign. And when people would give money to the yeshiva in the land of Israel, so they would give to this organization. And Yachatz would hand out the funds, dividing them between those 3. But Hevron was the smallest of the 3, and therefore they only got 3 parts out of 24 of the allocation from the Yachatz. So they were like the poor cousin, the Jews of Hevron. In the 18th century, there was some improvement as a better fundraising mechanism was introduced, and this is when their most famous son, Chida, those who come to Kesher week by week have heard me mention Chida many times this year. He's my friend for the year, Chaim Yosef David Azulai. And he was a fascinating personality, but he was sent to Europe and the Mediterranean lands as well as a Shadar, Shlucha D'Rabbanan, to raise money for the community in Hevron. Because he was charismatic, he was learned, he was a polymath as well. He could speak multiple languages, and he was an excellent statesman. He made a very fine impression on people who met him. He was a good fundraiser. So he sent money back to Hevron, and that was an improvement in the 18th century for the Hevron community. In 1839, they were blessed with a visit from Moses Montefiore. I'm sure you've heard of Moses Montefiore, possibly the greatest Anglo-Jewish personality certainly of the 19th century he was. And in 1839, on one of his several trips to the Holy Land, he visited Hevron and he handed out a lot of money. That was a big event for the Hevron community. And 2 years later, he renovated Rachel's tomb, which is only a few miles away from Hevron. If you've ever visited there, you may have be aware that it's nearby, in 1841. So that was like drew tourists to the area because there's something to see now. So it was good news for the Jews of Hevron. By the late 19th century, things were fairly stable. About 1,500 Jews, including Rabbi Chaim Chizkiya Medini. I hope you've heard of him. He is the author of Sdei Chemed. And those who are familiar with important Torah personalities will have come across him. But it didn't last because it was under the Holy Land was under the Ottoman authorities at that time, had been for hundreds of years, and the Ottoman Empire was crumbling. And the decline set in as the Ottoman Empire, known as the sick man of Europe, began to crumble, or continued to crumble, I should say. There was desperate poverty. By 1910, only 700 Jews. So within about a generation or less, the population, Jewish population, collapsed from 1,500 to 700. Nobody wanted to live in Hevron. Chalutzim, even religious ones, the Chalutzim, of course, were the pioneers, those motivated by a desire to reestablish the Jewish presence in the Holy Land. They didn't want to live in Hevron. Even the religious ones, they were not attracted to a dusty, impoverished town on the edge of the desert, which was in the shadow of Jerusalem. So why go to live in Hevron? But things got worse. In 1914, with World War I, the boys of Hevron, I'm sure the Arabs as well, were conscripted into the army. In Europe, they were conscripted to the army of the Tsar. Here, they were conscripted to the army of the Sultan. It's a choose your poison, you know. One is misery, the other is perdition. So they fled, and no donations from abroad during World War I. It was a time of economic trauma and terrible upheaval throughout the world, including the Middle East as well. The kollalim all closed. Kollel was an institution for distributing charitable funds. At that time, and I think there was only one Sephardi kollel that kept going, so times were very, very dark. In 1918, things improved. What happened in 1918 in Palestine? The British Mandate. So after World War I, they divvied up the remains of the Ottoman Empire, and again, for good or for better, Britain inherited what was then Palestine, British Mandate. And that introduced something of an improvement, about 430 Jews in a population of 16,000. In 1925, the Slobodka yeshiva arrived. Slobodka was a very important yeshiva in Lita, in Lithuania. Slobodka was and is a suburb of Kovna. It's across the river from Kovna. I don't know if anyone here was with us on our Lithuanian trip. Anyone here came to Lithuania with us? No, okay. Oh yeah, Ruthie. Yeah, oh okay, very good. So you may be aware that Slobodka is a suburb of Kovna. It was the site of a very great yeshiva, and we'll talk a bit more about that yeshiva shortly. The yeshiva moved, or one branch of the yeshiva moved to the land of Israel, to Hevron, and as a result, there were approximately 700 Jews out of a population of 18,000. The reason the Slobodka yeshiva moved, by the way, to they left Slobodka, is that the Tsar was planning to, it was after the days of the Tsar really, because it was already after the Communist Revolution. But in any case, there was talk, serious threats of basically conscripting all the boys into the army, and it was regarded as a matter of pikuach nefesh, and to learn in yeshiva in Lithuania was becoming too dangerous, too risky, and they decided to open a branch, and most of the yeshiva moved to Hevron. Rav Moshe Mordechai Epstein moved with the yeshiva to Hevron, and boys from Eretz Yisrael went to learn at that yeshiva. Some from Lita moved with the yeshiva to learn there, and as we shall see, boys from England and a number of boys even from the United States went to Hevron yeshiva, which was called Knesset Yisrael, which was the name of the yeshiva in Slobodka, and that was the name of the yeshiva in Hevron. It became known as Hevron Yeshiva, and to this day, it's no longer in Hevron, but it is known as Hevron Yeshiva. It's in Yerushalayim now. I want to talk a little bit about, in number 3, for those following, description of Slobodka Hevron and its impact on the Torah world to this day. Many of the great yeshivas in America and worldwide are direct derivatives of Slobodka. That is to say, they were founded by students of Slobodka yeshiva, or maybe second generation students in some cases. I mean, now already probably 3 or 4 generations. But those great yeshivas were founded by men who were imbued with the fervor and with the determination and with the commitment and with the confidence to seek to replant the seeds of Torah study in the inhospitable soil of the United States of America. So we have, for example, Lakewood Yeshiva, the famous Lakewood Yeshiva, which has today spawned a large number of derivatives of Lakewood Yeshiva, and Lakewood itself is a town in New Jersey which is dominated by Lakewood Yeshiva. So Lakewood comes from Slobodka, Mir comes from Slobodka, Yeshiva Chaim Berlin, founded by Rav Hutner. I'm not sure if he founded it really. He was the great Rosh Yeshiva of Chaim Berlin. He learned in Slobodka. And Ner Yisrael Yeshiva in Baltimore, some of you may have heard of it. That's where our son Sadia learned for many years. Chavetz Chaim, my alma mater, is a direct derivative of Slobodka Yeshiva, and those Talmidim, and I'll mention a friend of mine from Chavetz Chaim shortly, we consider ourselves to have maybe mission is too strong a term, but we aspire to carry on the teachings of Slobodka Yeshiva. Slobodka emphasized the study of Musar, emphasized duty to the klal, to the community, duty to the generation, duty to spread Torah and to inspire others to learn Torah. And I would like to think that some of what I've accomplished in my life is a consequence of the teachings of Slobodka Yeshiva. My Rosh Yeshiva's father was a close Talmud of the Alter of Slobodka, and I feel a special kinship to the Slobodka Yeshiva for that reason. I want to mention, and this is a slight, I wouldn't say it's a digression, but I had said at the beginning I want to provide some context as well. We'll talk about the horrors of the massacre shortly. But I want to read to you a little bit about a young man called Dave Scheinberg. I hope you're following. If you are on your outline, you must have noticed that photograph that I've included, that jaunty young man. There's no space for a larger picture of it, but I've got it here as well. The same picture that you have of this smiling young man dressed like a good Slobodka boy with a modern suit. You know, I used to wear a suit like that until someone important to me thought I would look more rabbinic in another kind of suit. But anyway, those were the days. Dave Scheinberg was 22 years old. He was born in Memphis, Tennessee. I don't know whether anyone here has ever been to Memphis, Tennessee. You've probably heard, you've been to Memphis? Oh, I like it. Yeah. So you've been to all the good places, Mrs. Kaufman. Your niece lives there, is that right? Okay, Memphis, Tennessee is a southern town. It's south of the Mason-Dixon line. It's a lovely place to visit, Memphis, Tennessee. I'm sure nobody here has ever heard of him, but Elvis Presley lived there, and his place called Graceland remains a mecca for music lovers. I even visited there myself. Eschatani Mazkir. This is Memphis, Tennessee. It's far, far from New York. You've been to Memphis as well? Okay, another one is admitted to visiting Memphis. There you have it. Okay. Dave Scheinberg was born in Memphis, Tennessee in 1906. I have a friend from yeshiva. Actually, his sister was our shadchan for Ruthie and me. So she's called Chana, and she has a younger brother who actually went to learn in Chavetz Chaim Yeshiva in New York. We weren't there at the same time, but I feel a kinship to him because we learned in the same yeshiva. And he was a rabbi in Pennsylvania, and a few years ago, he became the rabbi of the Young Israel of Memphis, Tennessee. And after he was there for, I don't know, a year or two, he heard about a boy called Dave Scheinberg who was born in Memphis and went off to yeshiva in New York. And from New York, he made his way to Hevron. And he was among those martyrs, those Kedoshim who were murdered in the Hevron Massacre of 1929. And Dave Scheinberg, I don't know whether they're still living, but as of a few years ago, there were 2 women who were nieces of this Dave Scheinberg. And they live in Memphis, Tennessee, And they had letters that he wrote to the family, and the family treasured those letters, and they gave copies of those letters to my friend, whose name is Akiva Males, and he published them just recently, just a couple of months ago. He published them, some of those letters, and I'd like to read you some excerpts from those letters. Now, the letters do not describe the massacre. He was a victim of the massacre. He didn't write any letters after that, maybe from Shamayim. But he wrote letters about his journey and other things about Hevron and about the yeshiva. And I have to say that I feel a kinship with Dave Scheinberg. Although I'm not from Memphis, I'm also from a small town in the Midwest. It's not that close to Memphis, but it is. We share the fact that we're far from New York City. He was an American boy. You'll see, from the way he writes. And I also went off to yeshiva in Israel. I went under much more favorable circumstances than he did, but I can still relate to his enthusiasm, his excitement, his maybe naivete. And I think it takes me back 40 years ago when I was in yeshiva and I wrote letters home to my parents describing what I saw and what I did and the study of Torah and how animated I was by it and how enthused. He has some of those same ideas. So I'd just like to read you a few little excerpts. He writes from Brooklyn, is the first letter that's mentioned here. He writes from Brooklyn in the beginning of September 1928. And he's explaining his planned trip to Hevron, and it's going to consist of sailing from New York to France for 5 days aboard a certain ship, and he spent Rosh Hashanah aboard the ship, crossing the Atlantic. Then he traveled by train from the port to Paris, and then by train further from Paris to Trieste in Italy. I'm not sure if it was Italy then, but it is Italy now. Sailing from Trieste to Alexandria in Egypt. And from Alexandria, he made his way to Jaffa in what was then Palestine, and he arrived in time for Sukkot. I'm not sure where he did Yom Kippur exactly, but it was a long journey. And you see that it must have been very costly and quite difficult in those days. But such was his desire to go to learn in Hevron Yeshiva. So he writes in his first letter, I was forced to spend the night here since I arrived at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The customs house was closed for the day. Most offices and a good many business establishments close at 1 o'clock. Oriental laziness. That's what he has to say. This is part of why the Ottoman Empire was so decrepit, really, because it didn't work. And he writes, Mr. Mintz and I, must have been a friend of his, have been inspecting the place of historical interest in Jerusalem. A visit to the Wailing Wall, the only remains of the ancient temple, was enough to break one's heart. There, close by the reeking odor of the narrow, dirty streets of Old Jerusalem, a Jew realizes that the glory of God has departed from Zion, and that Israel is in exile, and much more so especially at this time. I suppose you have read in the press of the terrible incident which happened on Yom Kippur. The English soldiers roughly attempted to tear down the curtain separating the men worshippers from the women at the Wailing Wall. In other words, they wanted to establish a more respectable environment for prayer on Yom Kippur. So they put up a mechitza so the women could pray, the men could pray. In the older Kyoto, they had no mechitza because they didn't go to pray. They went to cry. But on Yom Kippur, they wanted to pray, maybe to cry as well, and they set up a mechitza. So the British soldiers came to tear down the mechitza. A riot ensued which resulted in a woman being wounded. Ever since, the Jews of entire Palestine have made sharp protests, have held demonstrations. One mass meeting in Tel Aviv brought out more than 10,000 people and have held parades of protest. Okay, he goes on to reflect on the irony that the Jews had lived with the Arabs for a long time, happily or unhappily, but they were getting along, and now the British come, and in his view, the British are taking the side of the Arabs. Now, it's not my intention to stick up for the British here, but they were probably trying just to maintain the status quo. They were just desperate to keep the two sides, the Jews and the Arabs, from killing one another and maintain the status quo. But they managed to satisfy no one in that regard. Certainly they did not satisfy the Jews, and we'll talk more about that shortly. He mentions in a few places Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank, just as an aside, but anyone who's familiar with great halachic authorities of the 20th century will know Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank was the posek of Yerushalayim. He was the chief rabbi of Jerusalem. He was the Av Beis Din of Yerushalayim for many years, more than 3 decades. He was the Talmid of Rabbi Shmuel Salant, successor of Shmuel Salant, and the Beis Din in Yerushalayim, Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank. So he had 2 sons-in-law who were rabbis in America, one of them in Memphis. So it was that son-in-law in Memphis who must have encouraged young, idealistic Dave Scheinberg to go to Eretz Yisrael to learn. And so he mentions in a few places those families. It's interesting, Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank had a son who was in yeshiva, in Hevron yeshiva as well. He later became a member of Knesset for the Labor Party. I don't think he followed in his father's rabbinic footsteps. Let's put it that way. But he mentions him in a couple of places in his letters. Then here's a passage which I find very poignant. I have started in on the gargantuan task ahead of me, he writes to his family in Memphis, to become learned in the Torah. The yeshiva here in Hevron offers wonderful opportunities for anyone possessing such an ambition. The faculty and student body both are full with professed scholars of Talmud and colossal minds in general. Boys of 16 or less here could vie with the most learned professors in mental capacity. So he says. He writes about the economics. He says, laundry prices advanced recently to 1 piaster, which is 5 cents a shirt. So you can see that a New York pauper is a Hevron millionaire. So he's loving it. Then he writes further about the boys in yeshiva. He's very impressed with them, very full of admiration for them. And he says, for the most part, they are neatly and modernly dressed, although a bit shabby, of course. In manners and deportment, they are perfect. The yeshiva is insistent upon a high standard of etiquette within the yeshiva and outside as well. And this was what I learned when I went to yeshiva as well. I couldn't get my shirt hanging out anymore. That's why I started to wear a necktie every day of the year, except Tisha B'Av. And that comes from the Slobodka tradition and Slobodka emphasis on gadlus ha'adam, appearance, which is important. Some members of my family feel I don't quite meet that standard all the time. But nevertheless, that's what the yeshiva taught me. Maybe I don't live up to it. The character of each of the 200 students is of the highest imaginable. Even I was surprised at what I found. The student body is composed of the purest type of idealists. And he goes on to talk more about them. Then he says, all in all, I thank God every minute of the day that he brought me to the yeshiva here in Hevron. Here not only can I best acquire that knowledge which I seek, but I am in a thoroughly Jewish atmosphere and on holy ground. Again, I find it very moving, his candor and his enthusiasm of how happy he is to be in an atmosphere of Torah learning. He speaks a bit about Hevron itself, about the buildings, about the people, about the sanitation, which was not of the highest madrega, shall we say. He has a comment here about, he wrote this letter on the 19th of December, 1928. He says, thank God I hear no firecrackers or any other evidence of a Christmas holiday here in Hevron. He says, in parentheses, one great advantage of living in an Arab settlement. The Arabs nurse an intense hatred for the Christians because of their missionary activities, and rightfully so. He says that when the yeshiva arrived, the Arabs were not so happy with this influx of the yeshiva, but friendly relations were implanted in the following manner. A young Arab pelted the rabbi's home with stones. The rabbi, he means Rav Moshe Mordechai Epstein, the Rosh Yeshiva of Hevron. A young Arab pelted the rabbi's home with stones, injuring 2 members of the family and causing considerable damage in broken windows, etc. He was arrested and brought to trial. The rabbi went before the judge and pleaded that the culprit be set free. This event occurred some 3 years ago. Ever since then, there has been no trouble whatsoever. And to the contrary, now the Arabs treat the yeshiva students with utmost respect and courtesy. A soft answer turneth away wrath, said Solomon in Proverbs, and here we see the truth of his wisdom. The tragic irony will be revealed, of course, when we consider the massacre that was still in the future. I want to read in slightly greater length the last letter which is recorded here, which he writes on the 14th of Av, 1929. the 14th of Av, 5 days after Tisha B'Av, and about 4 days before the terrible massacre, which we'll describe shortly. So he's writing to his family about his Tisha B'Av experiences. Dearest Dad, Amush, Tisha B'Av in Jerusalem, what an inspiration, what a poignant sense of sorrow and mourning. I accompanied several friends, all students of the yeshiva, to Jerusalem for Tisha B'Av. As we walked along Jerusalem streets, we could almost imagine the streams of Jewish blood flowing at our feet, the horrible scenes of slaughter, Jewish sages, budding youth, tender babes in their mothers' arms, all killed by the barbaric sword of the enemy. A visit to the Wailing Wall brought our national tragedy home to us in the strongest sense. Our sacred temple destroyed, the actual and literal dwelling place of the Almighty, the fountain from which divine light emanated to the entire world. Our sages expressed themselves as follows: had the Romans but known what great benefits and blessings they enjoyed from the Sukkot sacrifices, she never would have destroyed the temple. This year had an especial import for Tisha B'Av. Now, this paragraph is extremely poignant because, sadly, it represents the proximate cause for the massacre that would engulf the whole country, and especially Hevron, in just a few days' time. This year had an especial import for Tisha B'Av. No doubt you have all been following news of the Wailing Wall. The Arabs are employing all their inherent slyness and cunning to confiscate this holiest of Jewish relics of a glorious past. Jerusalem has been in a state of constant excitement and tension for 10 months now, and Tisha B'Av, this tension reached almost the breaking point. The wailing at the wall was heart-rending to hear. Even the so-called irreligious among us, the Chalutzim, prayed with a fervor at the Chatzar HaKosel. That's the courtyard, which at that time was very small, but whatever space there was, they went there to pray. And to top it all, some 2,000 Chalutzim marched in a body to the wall, and there, in the very face of the British soldiers, engaged in a fiery demonstration against Great Britain, the cause of British and to the Arab cause in the wall controversy. It doesn't quite make sense. He may have just erred with his pen or something. But the point is that the protest was against the British because of their collusion with the Arabs, certainly from the Jewish perspective. It was an awe-inspiring scene to witness these young people, sturdy and strong, raise their hands before the holy Wailing Wall and take a solemn oath to defend the last remains of the Jewish temple with their last drop of blood. If our irreligious, our sons and daughters who follow a false path can display such sacrificing and gallant spirit, what should our Torah true Jews not do? Truly, if forced to do so, I could derive nourishment for an entire lifetime, both spiritual and inspiring, from those 24 hours in Jerusalem. Well, little did he know that he would have to do exactly that. I just want to mention a footnote here, which my friend Rabbi Males has appended. Lots of footnotes here, but he adds a footnote about the reference to the Chalutzim, 2,000 of them who came to march at the Kotel. I mean, the whole Kotel Plaza at that time was probably not larger than the footprint of this building. So you can imagine there was no room for 2,000 people there. It must have created quite a crush. And in any case, just imagine even the old city of Jerusalem today, if 2,000 people turn up, their presence is going to be noticed. So the footnote here says, Dave had witnessed the Tisha B'Av march, which was organized by several groups, including the Pro-Wailing Wall Committee and the revisionist Zionist Beitar youth movement. Tragically, this event would be used by Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the infamous Grand Mufti of Jerusalem and friend of Adolf Hitler, as a pretext to whip his co-religionists into a frenzy, which just days later would develop into the savage riots of 1929. It was during those riots, that Dave was ruthlessly murdered. So that's a bit of context. I want to discuss now the massacre itself, but because I've mentioned that pro-Wailing Wall Committee, I will just read you a little bit more about it. I don't know how long it lasted for, but tragically, although I think I do sympathize with the objectives, the consequences of this campaign were catastrophic. a man called Joseph Klausner. He was a revisionist Zionist. Don't think he was religious, but he was a professor of literature, Hebrew literature at Hebrew University. And he founded this entity called the Pro-Wailing Wall Committee. A very awkward turn of phrase, but that's what he called it, the Pro-Wailing Wall Committee. And I'll read you their declaration, which was promulgated during the 9 days. In other words, just a few days before Tisha B'Av. Ye Jews in all parts of the world, wake up and unite. Do not keep silent or rest in peace until the entire wall has been restored to us. Form yourselves into pro-wailing wall societies. Hold meetings of protest. Go and demonstrate before the British consuls in all countries on behalf of the wall. Submit protests to them. Explain to the Jewish masses and to the young generation what has been and what is the kotel to Israel in the past and at present. Explain to the righteous and the pious among the nations of the world what is the national insult we have suffered at the hands of the British officials without justice or right. Move heaven and earth in the unspeakable and unprecedented injustice, at the unspeakable and unprecedented injustice and oppression which tends to rob a live nation of the last of its relics and its poor man's lamb. A reference to Pasuk in Melachim. Those of us who are here will not rest until that relic, which has always been ours, which has been sealed with the blood of scores of thousands of our children through 2 millennia, which has absorbed the tears of Israel for 2,000 years, has been restored to us. Come to our help by cooperating in this just struggle for the wall, and triumph is sure to come. Jerusalem, during the 9 days of mourning, 5689. So this was an effort to pressure the British, to raise international outcry at the fact that the Jews do not have access even to that small part of the kotel. You know, the kotel we have today was only revealed after 1967. At that time, the whole expanse of the kotel was maybe twice the size of this length. That was the whole kotel. And the depth of the courtyard, again, did not go back very far either. And he said this is a grave injustice. But the Arabs, and I'm not trying to defend them in any way, but they were spooked by it. And apparently the Zionists and probably perhaps non-Zionists as well, they want to get political at that level, used as a fundraising device images of the kotel, images of Har HaBayis, with like a Magen David transposed over it, or maybe even an image of the Beis HaMikdash, which is going to be built, which we look forward to. But the Arabs thought that this is like a campaign. This shows the intention. The Jews are raising money in order to raise the mosque and to set, build the Beis HaMikdash there. Now, again, it's not my intention to get political, but just from a historical perspective, these are some of the concerns or some of the circumstances that the Arab nationalists were able to stoke in order to rouse fervor and hatred, and as we shall see, terrible savagery against the Jews of Eretz Israel, what was then Palestine, in general, and Hevron in particular. So I want to continue now to tell you about the massacre a little bit. As I said, it has been thoroughly documented. Many resources are available online as well. It happened on Shabbos, 23rd and 24th August. It was Chai Menachem Av, the 18th of Av, almost exactly 90 years ago. It was a premeditated and deliberate bloodbath. 67 were killed in cold blood. The Jews probably in almost every case, maybe without exception, were unarmed. It was women, it was children. The women were normally raped first, at least once or more before they were murdered. I suppose some were only raped and were not murdered, but the suffering was unspeakable. Of the 67 killed, 55 were Ashkenazim, including 25 yeshiva students. 60 were wounded. Synagogues were destroyed and looted. Torah scrolls were desecrated. The British-controlled police were passive. This is, to my mind, one of the great scandals of this massacre was the inaction of the British. Now, the British, and again, I'm not looking to defend them, but just for the sake of historical clarity, the police force was under British control. But the police force, well, there were about 40 of them. They were all Arabs, 1 Jew and 40 Arabs. The chief of police was a British guy called Raymond Cafferty, but all of his policemen were all Arabs. So whether he wanted to protect the Jews or didn't want to protect the Jews, he was limited. I'm not trying to defend him. According to many sources, they could tell, the Jews could tell that things were not looking good. There were rumors, there was the arrival of Arabs from the surrounding villages, and they were worried. And they appealed to this Raymond Cafferty for protection. And he said, no, we're not going to protect you. You know, you're the source of your own troubles. The thing is this. The Arabs did not necessarily love the Sephardic Jews, but they had been living side by side with them for centuries. They were neighbors, they did business together. Remember, the Jews were receiving donations from abroad, which means that they were a cash cow to the Arabs. So if the Jew is doing whatever he does, but he survives by donations from London and Paris and Frankfurt and New York, then who does he buy his milk from? Who does he buy his bread from? Who does he buy his camel services when he needs to be transported to Jerusalem? Of course, the local Arabs. So they had a kind of live and let live attitude, even if they didn't really like one another that much, but it was useful for them to get by with one another, a bit like British and the EU. And therefore, they were not the Arabs were not spooked, and were not, by which I mean they were not like riled up against the Sephardim. It was the Ashkenazim, and especially the Zionists, who had designs to create a Jewish state there. So they especially wanted to harm the Ashkenazim, and so they did. As we mentioned, 55 out of 67 of the victims were Ashkenazim. I want to read you a passage about the rampage and killing, and I have to say, this is only a short passage. The full account is so gruesome that even on Tisha B'Av, I'm not comfortable presenting it here in a public forum. Suffice to say, the savagery, the bestiality, the sadism was almost unsurpassed, maybe only by the Nazis. They lost no opportunity to torture and to dismember and to mutilate the bodies before death, after death. In one of the homes of the chief rabbi, Rabbi Slonim, there were about 40 Jews who were sheltered there. And they managed to they couldn't break through the door, but they managed to climb a tree and jump onto the roof and break through one of the windows, and they began to massacre everyone inside. Some fled. They weren't all massacred, some fled. But they completely trashed the place, and I have to say that it was just sickening to read an account of a journalist. Ari Kisselstein provided me with this account of a journalist who said when he went in a couple of days later, he tried to go back after that, they wouldn't let him in. But initially, he was able to go. He's a journalist. He was able to go, and he saw there wasn't one chair, one utensil that was whole. The only thing that remained, excuse me for being graphic, was a picture of Theodor Herzl. They left it. They draped over it a blood-stained lady's underwear. You can imagine what happened to her. They draped it over the portrait of Theodor Herzl. That was their gesture. They murdered whoever they could get their hands on. I want to read you a passage. Actually, I got these photographs as well. Ruth and I bought these many years ago. We have them in our home. And the guy who sold it to us sold us a storage. I never quite knew if I could believe it. But actually, it is true. When I was preparing for this lecture, this is, it says here, a type of a rabbi, and it was photographed by a French photographer who came to Palestine in 1921. Took a lot of photographs. You can probably find them online. Very evocative photographs, and we bought these two. And here this one says, the rabbi and his great-grandson. This rabbi is Rabbi Slonim. He was the chief rabbi of Hevron, and his son, I'm going to read you about him in one moment. So I'll just pass these around because he was murdered in the Hevron riots, and so was this boy, his great-grandson.
What was the name of the photographer?
The photographer, Nurinsky. It's not clear to me if he was Jewish or not. It sounds like a Polish name, but I think he was French, and you can look him up, Nurinsky, in 1921. I want to read you a passage. It's not as gruesome as what I was describing, but heartrending all the same. Soon after news of the first victim had spread, 40 people assembled in the house of Eliezer Dan Slonim. He was the son of the chief rabbi, and Slonim, the son of the rabbi of Hevron, was a member of the city council and a director of the Anglo-Palestine Bank. He was born in Hevron, he grew up in Hevron, and although I saw a picture of him, I was worried he was like a certain other person I mentioned who departed from the rabbinic ways. The picture of him, he looks not much different than his father. In the picture that I saw of him, you can find it online if you like as well. He looked like a Hasidic Yid with a long beard, and he was the director of the Anglo-Palestine Bank. He was a respected member of the community, and he had excellent relations with the British and the Arabs. And those seeking refuge with him were confident they would come to no harm. When the mob approached his door, they offered to spare the Sephardi community if he would hand over all the Ashkenazi yeshiva students. He refused, saying, "We are all one people," and he was shot dead along with his wife and 4-year-old son. From the contemporary Hebrew press, it appears that the rioters targeted the Zionist community for their massacre. 4/5 of the victims were Ashkenazi Jews, as we have seen, but some had deep roots in the town. Yet a dozen Jews of Eastern origin, Sephardim and Maghrebi, were also killed. And listen to this. Gershon Ben Zion was a Sephardi Jew, Ottoman Jew. He was the pharmacist at Beit Hadassah Clinic. Beit Hadassah, and I'm going to talk about Beit Hadassah later on as well. Beit Hadassah was the name given to a clinic. It was the only medical facility in Hevron. It was paid for by a Jew from, I think, Vilna. I'm sure ongoing donations for the maintenance of the place. It was a pharmacy. It was a clinic. It was like a sort of primitive hospital that treated all of the citizenry of Hevron, Jew and Arab, for free. How many Jews were there? 700. How many Arabs? 18,000. And he was the pharmacist there for 40 years. A cripple who served both Jews and Arabs for 4 decades was killed together with his family. His daughter was raped and then murdered. What kind of motivation can bring a person or a mob to murder someone who's been dispensing medication to heal the citizenry for 40 years? It's only hatred. It's only irrational hatred. Our time is nearly up because we want to get on to the time for the rest of our program as well. I want to talk a little bit, I want to talk, for those following the outline, we're in number 5, letter B, the cause. I've already spoken about that, but just a few more words. Demonstration against British collusion with the Arabs to keep the Jews from gathering at the Kotel, and the show of strength 9 days earlier on Tisha B'Av. It fed rumors of Jews seizing control of the Temple Mount, instigated by the Mufti of Jerusalem and friend of Hitler, Hajj Amin al-Husseini. Apparently, there was a doctored photograph. It's interesting, it's not just the Facebook era, but there was a doctored photograph that was circulated among the Arabs of the Jews who were occupying the Temple Mount, or something to that effect. So the Jews in Hevron thought that what was happening in Jerusalem, which was only about 18 kilometers away, was that the Jews were occupying the Temple Mount, etc., and that riled them and sort of became the fuse that triggered this terrible massacre. But by the way, it was completely premeditated, because it wasn't only Hevron. They had in Jaffa, they had in Tzfat, they had in Jerusalem. It was deliberately coordinated at the same time. They had a whole series of these massacres, of which Hevron is the most infamous. And we mentioned already in letter C the declaration of the pro-Wailing Wall Committee, which again probably helped, sadly, to precipitate this reaction. The simultaneous pogroms you mentioned as well. I want to talk about briefly number 6 as well, however. Again, I'm no Arab apologist, please, but I think for the sake of historical breadth, it has to be recognized that not every Arab in Hevron participated in this massacre. There were actually a number of Arab individuals and families that saved Jews. If you look at number 6, the question of how many Arabs sheltered and saved Jews, there were at least 19, probably as many as 28 or more Arab families that sheltered Jews, knowing that this massacre was going to happen. And one Arab sheltered 33 Jews in his cellar at great personal risk. Malka Slanim, I don't know how she's related to the rabbi, would have been a granddaughter, a niece, I'm sure, or married to, I'm sure, a member of the family. She was saved by an elderly Arab named Abu Shakar, and I want to read her account because it does a little bit to restore one's, I don't know if faith is the right word, but recognition of the diversity of humanity. And not every Arab in Hevron was a bloodthirsty murderer. According to Malka Slonim, an aged Arab called Abu Shakar defended them. I suppose his name Shakar is like Shukra, which means thanks, rather than Sheker, which means lies. But anyway, it's neither here nor there. Listen to what he did. No, he's someone we should respect. Listen, we sat silently in the sealed house, and Abu Shakar reported what was happening. The rioters had arrived. We heard them growling cries of murder. We also heard the voice of Abu Shakar, "Get out of here! You won't enter here! You won't enter here!" They pushed him. He was old, maybe 75 years old, but he had a strong body. He struggled. He lay in front of the entrance to the home by the door and cried out, "Only over my dead body will you pass through here, over my corpse." One rider wielded his knife over Abu Shakar and yelled, "I will kill you, traitor!" The knife struck him. Abu Shakar's leg was cut. His blood was spilled. He did not emit any groans of pain. He did not shout. He only said, "Go and cut. I am not moving." The rioters consulted with each other. There was a moment of silence. Later we heard them leaving. We knew we had been saved. We wanted to bring our Savior inside and bandage his wound and thank him. He refused and said that others might arrive and that his task had not ended yet. This is heroism. Okay? When I was in high school, a teacher of mine in high school, in yeshiva high school, told me that his uncle, and this goes back when I was in high school, well back into the last century. You can see how white my beard is. So it was in the 1970s. And his uncle, he said, was a student in the Hevron yeshiva at that time, and he took refuge in an Arab home. And he said that he stayed there for the day until the riot had ended, and they protected him. They didn't harm him. They didn't, kick him out. They didn't say to the rioters, "Hey, there's a Jew in here, come and kill him." They protected him. When he left, they shot him in the back. They didn't kill him, but they shot him in the back. I think
the family that protected him.
the family that protected him, because the Arabs have a very strong sense of hachnasas orchim. Someone who's in my home, it goes back to Lot in Sodom. Someone who's in my home, you don't harm him. I don't harm him. You don't harm him either. Even if I hate him, you don't harm him, and neither will I. Once he left, though, then they shot him, or they stabbed him. They didn't kill him, but they
didn't kill him. He was just wounded.
He was just wounded. They didn't kill him. Yeah, he survived. He survived. Yeah, yeah. Remembering the martyrs. A few days later, now this is something which I think was published in English only for the first time a few weeks ago. So I'd like to read a couple of short passages of remembering the martyrs. A few days after this terrible massacre in Hevron, the Magid Meisharim in Vilna, the Moret Tzedek, he means like the leading rabbinic orator in Vilna. His name was Rabbi Menachem Krakowski, and they gathered a memorial. They made a memorial gathering in Vilna, in the main synagogue in Vilna. I'll just read you just a few lines from that gathering. "We are gathered here within the ancient holy walls of this synagogue." This synagogue, by the way, the Vilna synagogue was one of the great synagogues in Europe in its day. It was built in the 17th century, and it was refurbished and expanded. It was an awesome, awe-inspiring edifice. Awesome because it had long, tall pillars. It was a wonder to behold. Of course, it was destroyed by the Nazis. They're still excavating it just now, and they're discovering fascinating things. The archaeologists are making discoveries about it. Anyway, this was 1929. The Nazis, Yimach Shemam, had not yet done their work. So he says, we are gathered within the ancient and holy walls of this synagogue, which remembers the persecutions of the Jewish people, which remembers too the years of Tach V'Tat, 1648, 1649. We will restate what is stated in the Torah. O nations, acclaim his people, for he will avenge the blood of his servants, wreak vengeance on his foes, and cleanse the land of his people. And he speaks about martyrdom, and he says we've had a lot of martyrs who've given up their lives because of their faith. But then he writes something contemporary. He writes, it was a presentation, an oral drasha. He says, we have many Kedoshim in our history, martyrs who sanctified their lives for the sanctification of God's name, who sacrificed their lives for the sanctification of God's name, for the covenant between Israel and our Father in heaven. There have also been martyrs who sacrificed their lives for the sake of the Torah, for its study and for its honor, so that it should not be desecrated by those who have risen to desecrate it, and those who carry its banner. Such martyrs we have had throughout our history. But Kedoshim, who sacrificed their lives for the sanctity of our land, for the honor of our land and for the sanctity of the temple, such Kedoshim we have not had for 2,000 years, since the time that the oppressor robbed us of our land and desecrated our temple. It's interesting. I'm not saying anticipated, I don't know if what he could anticipate in the future, but what he says in this drasha is something which has happened so many times since the state of Israel and before. Those who have given their lives to protect the land of Israel, the people of Israel, and maybe these yeshiva students and other innocent men and women and children also gave their lives in order to because they were seeking to reestablish the Jewish presence in the land of Israel. I want to read you also a few words from Rav Yitzchak Hutner. Rav Yitzchak Hutner was a student in Slobodka yeshiva. He was in Slobodka and also in Hevron as well. He was one of those young students who went from Lithuania to Hevron, and he studied in the Hevron yeshiva. He was away for Shabbos. Remember, this was during Bein Hazmanim, during the intercession. From Tisha B'Av until the beginning of Elul, the boys are on summer break. So this is why a disproportionate number of the victims were Americans and British, because the local boys went home for Bein Hazmanim. Some of the, like Rav Hutner and others, also happened to be away that Shabbos. There were quite a few who were away that Shabbos, thankfully. But those who were there, so many of them met their death. So they published a Sefer Zikaron, and Rav Hutner, although albeit a young man at that time still, was given the task of editing it. And I'll read you just a little bit of what he writes. A special place is occupied by the American contingent, who received, probably means British as well, meaning the foreigners, those from the Western lands, who received a double portion of the cup of tragedy from which we drank at the end of 1929, well, at the end of the Hebrew year, 5629. From the land of gold and silver, they came to the city of the patriarchs in order to dedicate their best years to the formation of their characters. What report did they hear that they came? Mashmua, Shamu Uvau, a combination of two words, Slobodka, Hevron. They heard and they came and they dedicated themselves with all their ability to the great task of improvement, of aliyah, of self-betterment, in order to return to their native land suffused with Torah and Yira, to bring light and warmth to their surroundings, to awaken the hearts of the young to follow in their path with great dignity and great strength. More than once did it seem that with the smiles on their faces, and I think of Dave Scheinberg, who would have been a friend of Yitzchak Hutner. They were yeshiva boys together. They must have recognized the bliss that would be their future life. So did they grow and flourish, blossom and bear fruit on the fountains of Torah and Yira, flowers of grace, nobles of Israel, in whom is our glory and our pride. And suddenly, in the middle of the sunshine of the day, the axe was waved, the feller had come up. There was no word in the mouth and no utterance in the tongue. Ki ein milah bilishoni, hein Hashem yadata kula. Only God will know why it happened and to whom. I'd just like to end, though, on a slightly more hopeful note. Now, we do need to finish in time because we want to have time for the video and, of course, to daven Mariv in timely fashion. But just very briefly, today, Hevron has grown to 220,000 Muslims, under Israeli oppression, of course, grown by 12-fold, and 800 Jews. 800 Jews. How did the Jews even arrive in Hevron? Well, it wasn't easy, because they were not any more welcome then than they were in the times that we've been discussing. But of course, after 1967, the Hevron and surrounding areas came under Israeli control. But the Israeli government was not keen to see Jews resettle Hevron. And again, I don't want to be political, but I think we can see why a little bit, because it was a tinderbox once before. So, there's a risk. But there were many people who wanted to return to Hevron, who felt it was a matter of principle and a matter of right, etc. and a certain rabbi advertised a Pesach hotel in 1968 in Hevron. He managed to rent a certain hotel, and for money you can do a lot of things. So they went for Pesach. They forgot to leave after Pesach. They forgot that Pesach in Israel was only 7 days, and now it's been about 40 years, and they're still there. So that is the Gar'in, the nucleus of the Jewish settlement in Hevron, and they stayed there. About 10 years later, in 1978, or thereabouts, this Beit Hadassah that I mentioned was derelict. It had been a pharmacy. It was an empty building. A few women with young children, some of them nursing mothers, they smuggled themselves in the nighttime and they began to occupy that Beit Hadassah. They had no light, they had no electricity, they had no heat, they had no water, they had young children. And it was very guileful, because who's going to kick out women and children? So the Israeli army was forced to protect them. And little by little, other people smuggled their way in. And even a young yeshiva boy called Rashi Simon went there for Shabbos in 1979. And I spent the Shabbos in Beit Hadassah. By that time, they had maybe 20 families. They had a few men there as well, mostly women and children, though. I spent Shabbos there in Beit Hadassah. And I have to say that I was inspired by the idealism, by the love of Eretz Israel, but I was also troubled by the hatred. Hatred towards the Arabs, hatred towards some groups within the Israeli society as well. And I thought to myself that you're paying a big price to raise your children in such an environment where they're protected by Israeli soldiers, surrounded by many, many hundreds, even thousands of Arabs who would like to kill them. And unfortunately, hate breeds hate. And they're still there in Beit Hadassah. And I'm a bit conflicted in my own mind, about it. And politically and in other respects, it's a matter of great controversy. So that's my Shabbat in Beit Hadassah. Hope for the future. I think, and I'm no political scientist, I'm no expert on Middle East conflict, just like everybody here, a concerned member of Klal Yisrael who hopes for the betterment of our people, who hopes for peace in the region, and who hopes for the restoration of Keren Yisrael, the glory of the Jewish people. I think the best way that I can foresee is with the coming of Mashiach. Amen.